Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lady and Her Monsters, a tale of dissections, real-life Dr. Frankensteins, and the creation of Mary Shelley's masterpiece, by Roseanne Motillo, narrated by Gould. Prologue. For I am building in the human understanding a true model of the world, such as it is in fact, not such as a man's own reason would have it to be, a thing which cannot be done without a very diligent dissection and anatomy of the world. Francis Bacon, The Works of Sir Francis Bacon. Camilo's footsteps echoed loudly as he crossed the empty cobblestone streets of Bologna toward his uncle's house. The afternoon was hot, and the scorching heat, coupled with that lazy mid-afternoon spell between noon and evening, allowed him to go by virtually unnoticed. Summer in the city proved vicious, and Bologna, the capital city of the northern Italian region of Emilia-Romagna, was suffering beneath the punishing sun. Harsh sunlight fell onto the red rooftops, distressing those inhabitants who had sought relief beneath one of the city's many porticos. The city had been built on the edge of Via Emilia, a military road constructed by the Romans in 187 BC. This extended from Piacenza, at the northernmost end, all the way to the Adriatic Sea. To the south, the city was bracketed by the Apennines, mountains that were as capricious as they were majestic, and to the north by the fertile lands and deep plains of the Po Valley, used for agriculture, farming, and raising livestock, particularly pigs. This had allowed Bologna to garner one of its many nicknames, Bologna la Grassa, Bologna the Fat. But as Camillo made his way across Piazza Maggiore, his mind was not on pigs, rather it was on frogs. He had been eagerly waiting for this day, but this infernal heat had been going on for weeks. Earlier, when he poked his head out of a window, something unusual had occurred. He heard the boom of thunder as it broke somewhere in the lowlands, and recognized the rumbles as they slowly made their way toward the city. Looking upward, he had noticed that thick dark clouds were slowly covering the sky. He then left his house and headed for the home of his uncle, the famed Luigi Galvani, one of the most renowned physiologists and obstetricians in Bologna. Galvani had also been waiting for storms. As of late, he had been delving into experiments that complemented the medical and surgical skills he practiced in the city's many hospitals. But for almost a decade now, he had also been studying the field of elettricità animale, animal electricity. As a doctor, the field of electricity in general interested him deeply, particularly as it related to the cure of paralysis. This so-called cure had been shown to work before. The Bolognese physiologist Giuseppe Verratti had applied electricity to various diseases, including paralysis and arthritis. The positive results were then set down in a book published in 1748 that Galvani had most certainly read. Late in the 1760s, Verratti's experiments had also included the use of frogs and other small animals. Although those particular findings were never published, he gave demonstrations at the famed Academy of Sciences in Bologna in the years 1769 and 1770, where, at the time, Galvani was a member of and professor at the Institute of Sciences. Galvani's choice of experimental animals also included frogs, what Hermann Helmholtz in 1845 called the martyrs of science. Thousands of these amphibians had been slaughtered in the company of Galvani's nephews, assistants, and wife, and eventually he arrived at one conclusion. There was a fluid inherent to all living creatures that ran from head to toe, and this could be manipulated with an outside apparatus, such as a metallic arc or a rod. This manipulation allowed the body to restore its inner activity, which in turn aided in the cure of paralysis and other diseases, restoring vitality. In time, Galvani found that pharmacology also influenced the results. In a lecture he delivered at the Academy of Sciences, he spoke of the effects opiates had on animal electricity. According to his notes, he injected opium into the frogs' abdominal cavities, stomachs, or cerebrums. While at first the frogs remained splayed and flaccid, they eventually revived and demonstrated a violent convulsion, either from a slight tremor of the surface upon which they were resting or from contact with some body. If he hacked off the frogs' heads and pumped their bodies with opium, he got the same results. But on that hot day, August 17, 1786, he wanted to prove a different theory, using a method that, in part, resembled Benjamin Franklin's famous kite experiment. He wanted to see if he could elicit movements in the frog's legs by employing atmospheric phenomena. Galvani, his wife Lucia, and his two nephews, who also served as assistants, gathered atop the balcony, the highest point in his house. Galvani had ordered metal hooks hung on the iron railings, and now a prepared frog dangled from each. The prepared frogs, he said, should be cut transversely, below their upper limbs, skinned and disemboweled. Only their lower limbs are left joined together, containing just their long crural nerves. These are either left loose or free, or attached to the spinal cord, which is either left intact in its vertebral canal or carefully extracted from it and partly or wholly separated. He gave the frogs the same close attention he gave all of his patients, employing the same expert surgical skills he had obtained at the Hospital of Santa Maria della Morte, St. Mary of Death, and St. Ursula. The movements of his hands were fluid, sinuous, and virtually flawless. Notebook in hand, Galvani took copious notes. Those who knew him were aware that he brought an almost religious fervour to his work. Of course, that was not a coincidence. In his childhood, he had wanted to devote his life to God, a life of obedience and order, going so far as to join the Oratorio dei Padri Filippini, a religious order. But as the firstborn in the family, his father, Domenico Galvani, and his mother, Barbara, who followed protocol and sent him to university, had chosen his path. It was at the University of Bologna, in the Faculty of Arts, that he came to realize the possibility of finding spiritual solace in scientific work. The university had been founded around the end of the 11th century and eventually became known all over the world as Alma Mater Studiorum, for being the oldest university in the Western world. It boasted scholars and researchers in many fields, from law to philosophy, but the study of medicine, particularly anatomy, eventually made it notorious. Lucia was the daughter of one of the most famous anatomists in the city, Domenico Guzmano Galeazzi. Unlike most children, Lucia had grown up privy to her father's experiments, which often involved mangled corpses being anatomized in a laboratory close to the family kitchen. During her youth, city officials had not precisely condoned anatomizations in private homes, though they had not discouraged them either. They had pretended not to notice when the weather warmed that the rotten stench of decaying bodies trickled out, the sickening odour of putrid flesh mingling with the cooking smells of the city. Even then, officials assumed that anatomists were learning information that would be useful not only for their students, but for people at large. They were correct. Through one of those experiments, Galeazzi first detected the presence of iron in the blood, and made even more discoveries regarding the body's gastrointestinal system. As the boom of thunder neared, Galvani and his crew noticed the amphibian's legs twitching, and as he later reported in his commentaries, just as the splendour and flash of the lightning are wont, so the muscular motions and contractions of those animals preceded the thunders, and, as it were, warned of them. The frogs behaved as expected, and, In correspondence of four thunders, contractions not small occurred in all muscles of the limbs, and, as a consequence, not small hops and movements of the limbs. These occurred just at the moment of the lightning. Although the frogs were dead, skinned and nearly eviscerated, when zapped by an electrical arc, or when they came in contact with a distant flash of thunder, their legs twitched in a way that made them seem as if they were ready to hop off the balcony and into the streets below. While this was happening, Galvani's tempestuous nephew, Giovanni Aldini, looked on, standing on that balcony, feeling the hot August wind, watching black clouds roll over his head, and hearing for the first time in days the slight pinging of rain on Bologna's rooftops. He must have realized that these experiments were more than just his uncle's folly. They were the very essence of life. In those moments, the theories that would direct the rest of his life began to form. Could those frogs truly return to life? And if that happened, what were the implications? Could his uncle's ideas later be used on lambs, oxen, sheep, and cows? And even further, could men benefit from such a thing? Not only the living, but also the dead. Could the process of reanimation be proven possible? In the years that followed, Giovanni Aldini further tested those theories. The climax of his experiments occurred on January 17, 1803, at the Royal College of Surgeons in London, where he performed a never-before-tried experiment on the body of a convicted felon. By then, many of his earlier experiments performed on animals and humans, some dead and some living, had convinced him that galvanism, the new science named after his uncle, presented an opportunity for restarting one of the body's main vital organs, the heart. If that were to happen, the dead could reawaken. By then, Aldini's experiments, and the topic of reanimation in general, had become fashionable in all of European society, from the natural philosophers, who began to delve deeper into the powers and possibilities of a vital force existing in humans and nature, to the more amateurish individuals, whose dubious endeavours merely allowed for a massive slaughter of frogs, pigs, and dogs, all in the name of science. It also became a go-to subject, not only in the scientific community, but also among artists and writers, and at crowd-pleasing soirees and salons all over England, France, and Germany. In the early 1800s, the distinction between a scientist, an artist, a political reformer, and a man of letters was not as clear-cut as it later became. The disciplines intertwined, the interests overlapped. As such, scientists like Humphrey Davy and Erasmus Darwin not only studied the topics of electricity and vitalism, but also wrote poems and essays on the subjects, which were published and well received by the public at large. Poets such as Mary Shelley experimented with galvanic electricity, poisons and gases, later jotting down long poems and odes that mused on the sublime mysteries of the natural world and the awesome powers of lightning and thunder. But one particular author, Mary Shelley, truly combined the urgency of scientific endeavours in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the lure of forbidden knowledge, and the power of literary interpretation in her masterpiece, Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. That it was published in 1818 and written barely a year and a half earlier was not a coincidence. She was well aware of the scientific procedures occurring around her. She had heard of Giovanni Aldini's experiments, first from her father's friend the medic Anthony Carlyle, who took great interest in such events and is believed to have attended Aldini's experiments, and later from her lover, Mary Shelley, and of his uncle Luigi Galvani's theories on animal electricity. She knew of Humphrey Davy and was aware of his lectures and writings, even using them and him for inspiration in her work. She had also read Erasmus Darwin's early theories of evolution. More important, her lover, who later became her husband, Percy Shelley, a poet, science aficionado, and fan of the macabre, was the one who introduced her to many of the scientific properties and theories exploding around her. He even went so far as to demonstrate certain experiments to her. Along with all of that, the literary publications of the time provided her with a good foundation. Thus, it is no surprise, given all Mary Shelley had at her disposal, that she was able to create the archetype of the famed, mad, brilliant scientist of the 19th century, Victor Frankenstein. Chapter 1. The Spark of Life. Her lips were red, her looks were free, her locks were yellow as gold, her skin was as white as leprosy, the nightmare life in death was she, who thicks man's blood with cold. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. On Sunday, August 24th, 1806, Mary Godwin and her youngest stepsister, Jane Clairmont, later Claire Clairmont, hid quietly beneath the couches in the parlour. Their home, a 5-story brownstone located on Skinner Street, had quickly become a stimulating hub for intellectual discourse, with Mary's father, William Godwin, the celebrated writer and reformer, as its master of ceremonies. The girls had not been invited to join the festivities, and no one knew they were even present in the parlour, as a great bustle took place about them. Having snuck in there when no one was looking, they worked hard not to be discovered. Jane Clairmont, Jane's mother and Mary's new stepmother, had forbidden them from attending these gatherings. Jane believed the conversations that took place among the crowd on religion, the existence of God, politics, and the so-called principle of life were inappropriate for young ears. Given her propensity for arguments, the girls often did as told, though sometimes Mary disregarded her stepmother and listened to her father's discussions from atop the staircase. But on that Sunday, the poet, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, had arrived on Skinner Street, and Mary knew he would be reciting verses from his famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, published some years earlier, in 1798. She had heard her father speak of it, and now wanted to hear it for herself. Learning of her plan, her stepsister naturally followed suit. Coleridge had met William Godwin in 1794, but like many who crossed paths with the reformer then, he had not been impressed. "He appears to me to possess neither the strength of intellect that discovers truth, or the power of imagination that decorate falsehood," Coleridge had said. "He talked futile sophism." But after meeting Godwin again, following the death of Godwin's first wife, Mary Wollstonecraft, Coleridge had changed his mind. Apparently, her death had mollified Godwin's character, softening his dark edges and making him more tolerable. As the two girls eavesdropped, Godwin and the rest of the gentlemen gathered in. The wood-panelled room had been filled with a great deal of brilliance before: Humphrey Davy, William Wordsworth, Charles Lamb, and many others. Now Coleridge took his turn. The poem was a mixture of poetical and popular language that some critics argued had come about as a direct response to the German Gothic horror tales that were now so popular in England. Rhyme had appeared some years after the publication of Gottfried Berger's Lenora, which had awakened popular fascination with the macabre. Writing some years later, a reviewer in the Monthly Review tied the publication of the rhyme to "a time when hell-made holiday and rowheads and bloody bones were the only fashionable entertainment for men and women." Others speculated that the poem had been inspired by the explorations of James Cook, particularly his second voyage into the South Seas. This notion was further bolstered because William Wales, the astronomer on Cook's ship, was also Coleridge's tutor. Perhaps Wales had told Coleridge about those experiences. But others argued that Coleridge, who was often plunged into the depths of great depressions and anxious fits, had found his muse in the massive amounts of opium he had used to relieve these symptoms, and that might have worked as a kind of hallucinogenic. The girls huddled closer together as Coleridge began his story of an old, ancient mariner who at first had been eager to leave his home in search of new continents. Upon his return from those explorations, he became adamant about telling his tale. While out walking one day, he stopped a man on his way to a wedding and recounted his travails. The man was indulgent for a time and found himself avidly listening and experiencing all the emotions a person went through in a lifetime. He was at times exhilarated, envious, and fascinated, and at others he felt sadness, sorrow, and even anger. And it is possible Mary and Jane, beneath the sofa, also suffered the same shifts in emotions as Coleridge's voice rang out. The wedding guest sat on a stone, he cannot choose but hear, and thus spake on the ancient man, the bright-eyed marineer. Coleridge captivated his listeners as the mariner recounted excitedly what good luck his ship had initially encountered, but it wasn't long before a mighty storm arose in the seas and blew the ship off course, driving it southward toward Antarctica, and the startled crew found relief in the sudden appearance of an albatross, which mysteriously began to guide them away from the bleak land of ice. Naturally, the sailors soon began to think the albatross had brought them much-needed good luck, but, watching them from afar, the mariner became disgusted by his crew's show of superstition. Angry, he lifted his eyes toward the albatross and, in a moment of unbridled passion, shot it dead. The crew became distressed and began to wail in despair, and as if echoing their own agony, the spirits swirling around them began to grieve the great abomination that had been committed against nature. To further inflict punishment, the spirits followed the ship through unfamiliar waters. The poem moved ahead, as the vessel did, Coleridge's voice most likely rising and falling as the waves continued to lull the ship. It was then that he described the encounter between the crew and the eerie vessel bordered by death, and the nightmare life in death. A struggle ensued, and nature struck back, killing all but the mariner. Filled with guilt for killing the albatross and the consequences of that act, the mariner was left doomed to wander the earth forever, always repeating his tale as a final act of atonement. He went like one that hath been stunned, and is of sense forlorn. A sadder and a wiser man, he rose the morrow morn. The girls stayed quiet as the tale ended, and the grown-ups began debating the various properties revealed in the poem, the images of life and death, the mysteries of sin, redemption, and the repercussions of guilt, the pursuit of forgiveness and forbidden knowledge, the ache and sorrow that loneliness brings, the belief in superstitions, of atoning for one's sins. A decade later, Mary Godwin would use similar imagery in the opening scenes of her most famous novel, Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. In it, the fictional character of Robert Walton, a mariner and explorer intent on finding a passage to the North Pole, appears and echoes Coleridge's mariner as he too was travelling into uncharted waters, trying to be the first explorer, not only to accomplish such a feat, but to do so while avoiding a mutiny on the ship. Coleridge's mariner is mentioned again when Walton, in writing to his sister Margaret, declares, "I am going to unexplored regions, to the land of mist and snow, but I shall kill no albatross, and therefore do not be alarmed for my safety." But many others were to inspire Mary Shelley in the writing of Frankenstein, though there was no indication of them yet. That evening she only knew that The Rime of the Ancient Mariner had made a deep impression on her soul, one that would last a lifetime. On the night of Mary Godwin's birth, August 30th, 1797, a storm descended upon the city of London that was later remembered as one of the most awesome displays of thunder and lightning anyone had ever seen. Loud, crackling noises pierced the night air, while jagged yellow lines crisscrossed the inky night sky. It was a wondrous spectacle Mother Nature seemed to revel in, and some were awed by it. The story of Benjamin Franklin's stealing thunder from the sky in 1752 was widely known and still played havoc in people's imagination, allowing them to believe in the testimony to the ability of human reason to bring nature under its sway. Natural philosophers, like the famed Humphrey Davy, also saw it as a vehicle not only to understand nature, but to interrogate her, not simply as a scholar, passive and seeking to understand her operations, but rather as a master, active with his own instruments. But others, given their superstitious and religious mindset, were frightened by nature's so-called wonders. To them, the idea that nature could be made to bow down to man bordered on the sacrilegious. If man could steal thunder from the sky, elicit electricity from the heavens, make dead frogs, sheep, and dogs jump, and impart a certain measure of respiration to the dead, then what need was there for a god who had dominion over everything and everybody? These people believed the angry thunderstorms of August 30th were a sign not of untamed knowledge, not of nature bending down to human will, but of God's wrath. The human race had overstepped its boundaries in some fashion, and God was now seeking his vengeance. But in the Godwin home, in the Somers Town district of London, neither idea was truly being contemplated. Those living within it thought of the powerful show outside their window as just a storm, a vicious storm that coincidentally was occurring on the night of the baby's arrival. Mary Wollstonecraft's labour pains had begun earlier that day. When she retired to her bedroom just before 2 p.m., feeling a nagging ache in the lower portion of her back, she slowly hiked up the staircase, aware of what to expect. Having gone through a pregnancy and childbirth before, her firstborn daughter, Fanny, was now 3, she knew what would happen in the hours ahead. No male doctor would be present at the birth. Instead, she had decided to have only a woman midwife to sit by and wait for the operation of nature. Her husband, William Godwin, waited downstairs. He had been a bachelor until the age of 41, and his rigid and somewhat inflexible manners had changed only upon the second meeting with, and subsequent awakening of his affection for, Mary Wollstonecraft. In his early 40s, he became a husband, a stepfather to Fanny, and a father-to-be. As they settled into a life together, Godwin tried to find his way among his new roles, though he still had a certain measure of inadequacy about him. When Mary's labour started, he was happy to remain below. As the afternoon and evening progressed, the storm intensified, much as Mary's labour did. Both, it seemed, were gathering momentum, and at about 9 o'clock Mrs. Blenkinsop arrived to serve as midwife. Mary's labour progressed relatively normally, and at 11:20 a baby girl was born. As the etiquette of the time required, William Godwin was asked not to enter his wife's room until all stages of labour and delivery were over. He waited patiently, but anxiously, watched the hours slowly ticking away, night ebbing into dawn. Eventually he heard the midwife's footsteps rushing toward him. She told him that the placenta was not yet removed. Unable to continue on her own, she advised Godwin to search for another doctor, this time a male one. The storm outside continued to rage on as a frightened Godwin rushed to call on Dr. Poignand, who arrived at the house several hours after the baby was born. The 18th century was a remarkably difficult time for mothers and their infants. Infections, mistakes, malnutrition, and lack of care before, during, and after a pregnancy all resulted in a surprisingly high number of deaths. Dr. Poignand was a typical physician of the era and did what he could under the circumstances. Arriving in Mary Wollstonecraft's chamber, he made a few disparaging comments about delivering a child without the aid of a male physician nearby, Then he rolled up his sleeves, raised the dampened sheets that covered Mary Wollstonecraft's sore body, and, without latex gloves...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?